The sunlight in the living room was always best in the late afternoon. It would spill through the big window with the slightly crooked blind, painting long, warm rectangles on the worn Persian rug. It was in that exact pool of golden light that the old upright piano sat, its dark wood scarred with the faint rings of forgotten drink glasses and the gentle scratches of time. And it was in that same light, every day after school, that the boy would sit, lift the heavy fallboard, and begin his hour. His name was Leo. He was 12. All knees and elbows, and a mop of hair that never seemed to lie flat. The piano, to him, was not yet an instrument of joy. It was a piece of furniture that came with obligations. 45 minutes of practice, 5 days a week, as mandated by his mother. "It builds discipline," she would say, and Leo would nod, thinking instead of the soccer ball gathering dust in the garage. His grandmother was a part of the room, as permanent and quiet as the bookshelf or the lamp. She was a small woman, his mother's mother, who had come to live with them a few years before. She had a name from her home country, a name that was made of soft, rolling sounds that felt strange in Leo's mouth, so to him she was simply Grandma. She seemed to live in the large floral print armchair that was angled toward the window, a vantage point that allowed her to watch the robins in the cherry tree outside. Leo's practice time was a predictable ritual. He would slump onto the polished bench, arrange his beginner book on the stand, and with a sigh that was too dramatic for anyone but himself to hear, begin. The first sounds were always the scales. C major, up and down, clumsy and uneven. C, D, F, G, A, B, C. His fingers, still learning their independence, would fumble, striking 2 keys at once with a jarring clang. He'd wince, glance quickly over his shoulder. Grandma never reacted. She would be in her chair, her hands busy with a pair of knitting needles or resting gently in her lap. Her gaze was usually directed out the window, following the flight of a sparrow or watching the clouds drift. Sometimes her eyes were closed, but Leo could never be sure she was napping or just listening. When he hit a wrong note, her face showed no flicker of irritation. When he finally managed to scale smoothly, there was no smile of encouragement. She was a statue of quiet observation. He would move from scales to his assigned pieces. Simple tunes with titles like The Happy Farmer or Moonlight Melody. They were built of quarter notes and half notes, plodding and childish. He played them without passion, counting the beats in his head, watching the minute hand on the wall clock creep with agonizing slowness. The living room, in that hour, was filled with a strange, disjointed soundtrack. The halting piano music, the soft click-click of knitting needles, the distant hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. Leo tried, sometimes, to engage her. After a particularly good run-through, or what he thought was good, he might turn and say, "That one's getting better, huh?" She would turn her head slowly from the window and offer a small, gentle smile. "It is music," she would say, her voice accented and soft like warm velvet. Then she would return to her window. "It is music. It wasn't well done." Or, "That sounded lovely, Leo." It was just a statement of fact, as if she had said, "It is raining." He found it frustrating. His teacher at school would give him shiny stickers. His mother would call out, "Sounds great, honey," from the other room, even when it didn't. But Grandma, his captive audience of one, gave him nothing got as the months turned into a year. Then, too, a quiet story built in Leo's mind. He decided she didn't really care for the piano. Maybe the sound bothered her. Maybe she thought it was a waste of time. Her constant silence began to feel less like peace and more like a mild, unspoken judgment. He started to imagine her thoughts. Asterisk, when will this noise end? Or, I wish I could have my quiet afternoon back. He began to practice with her presence as a kind of background challenge. He wasn't playing to please her. He was playing to fill the hour without embarrassing himself in front of this silent critic. He became more aware of the mistakes, cringing inwardly at each falter, convinced that behind him she was noting every one. The armchair by the window ceased to be just Grandma's spot. It became the seat of the impassive judge. The piano bench was his dock. His relationship with the instrument began to change, too, though he didn't fully realize it. The pieces grew harder. The simple 5-note melodies expanded into real compositions. He started learning a minuet by batch. It was mathematical, precise, and satisfying in a way a happy farmer never was. He fought with a tricky passage, repeating it 10, 20, 30 times, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was no longer just watching the clock. He was wrestling with a puzzle. During these struggles, he would sometimes forget she was there. His world would shrink to the span of the keyboard, the feel of the cool ivory under his fingers, the complex map of notes on the page. He'd get lost in the repetition, the slight adjustment of a finger, the search for the right rhythm dot, and in those moments, if he had been able to pull himself out of his focus and look, he might have seen a subtle shift. He might have noticed that her knitting would often still, that her gaze would drift from the cherry tree outside to the back of his head, to the curve of his shoulders as he leaned into the keys. Her expression, usually so placid, would hold something deeper, a concentration that matched his own, but tinged with a distant, unplaceable sadness. It was a look of someone hearing an echo from very, very far away, but Leo never saw it. He'd finish the frustrating passage, finally nail it, and let out a sigh of relief. He'd turn, seeking, almost instinctively, a reaction. And there she would be, her needles clicking again, her eyes on the window, as if the last 15 minutes of intense, musical struggle had simply evaporated into the afternoon air. He would turn back to the keys, a faint, resigned disappointment in his young heart. He was practicing piano for years, day after day, in the same room as her, and it felt, profoundly and completely, as if she wasn't hearing him at all. She was just a quiet old woman in a chair, waiting for him to be done so the real, familiar silence of the house could return. He was playing into a void, and the void, wrapped in a knitted shawl, sat 3 meters behind him, saying nothing at all. The seasons turned, and the boy at the piano grew. Leo's legs, which used to dangle awkwardly from the bench, now reached the floor with a solid stance. His hands, once small and unsure, had stretched, fingers gaining the span to finally, properly, tackle an octave. The simple beginner books were retired to a shelf, replaced by thicker volumes with titles like Classical Masterpieces for the Intermediate Pianist. The world outside the living room window became more complicated, full of school pressures and social puzzles. And the piano, almost without him noticing, stopped being a chore and started being an escape. The music changed first. Gone were the cheerful, forgettable tunes. Now he wrestled with the emotional storms of Beethoven. He learned a piece called Für Elise, and even though everyone knew it, he found a strange, lonely beauty in its circling melody. But it was the modern composers, the Impressionists, that truly captured him. His teacher gave him a piece by Claude Debussy called Clair de Lune. The first time he saw the sheet music, he felt a thrill of fear. It looked like a chaotic swarm of notes, with strange chords and instructions like expressive et raver, expressive and dreamy. Learning it was like trying to catch moonlight in his hands. It wasn't about hitting the right notes in the right order. It was about feeling, about creating a color with sound. He would play a chord and hold the pedal, letting the vibrations swim through the air of the quiet living room. He practiced the soft, cascading arpeggios over and over, his touch trying to be as light as a feather. He was no longer just playing the piano. He was trying to paint a picture with it, and through all of this, the grandmother in the chair remained. She was his constant, silent audience. Her hair seemed a little lighter, her movements a fraction slower, but her routine was unchanging. The armchair, the window, the knitting that never seemed to finish into anything in particular. But Leo's perception of her silence had hardened. Now 15, brimming with feelings he couldn't quite name frustration at a math grade, the sting of not being picked for a team, the confusing whirl of a first crush, he poured it all into the keys. He would hammer out the angrier passages of a Beethoven sonata, his shoulders tense. He would linger on the melancholy parts of Clair de Lune, feeling a deep, adolescent sorrow that seemed to match the music perfectly. And he would listen, not just to his own playing, but to the silence behind him. After a powerful, crashing chord, the note would fade into the room's air, and in that following quiet, he would wait. He would listen for the rustle of approval, a soft sigh, anything. All he would hear was the faint, rhythmic click-click of her needles, or the creak of the house settling. The silence began to feel heavy, like a blanket smothering the music. In his mind, it transformed from simple quiet into something else. A wall. A thick, impenetrable wall, built between his world of feeling and sound and her world of what? He didn't know. He started to invent stories about that wall. Maybe she thought classical music was boring. Maybe she only liked pop songs from the radio she sometimes listened to in the kitchen. Maybe, and this thought was the one that settled in his gut, she just didn't think he was any good. After all these years of practice, he was still just noise to her dot one Tuesday. Things came to a head. He'd had a terrible day. Everything had gone wrong, and he felt a hot, restless anger buzzing under his skin. He sat at the piano with a scowl, not even bothering with scales. He opened his book to a vigorous technical study by Czerny, all furious runs and sharp staccatos. He attacked it. His fingers flew, pounding the keys, not caring about subtlety or grace. It was loud, it was aggressive, it was pure release. Halfway through, in a whirl of motion, he messed up a complicated run. His fingers tangled, striking a horrible, clashing cluster of wrong notes that rang out like a shout in a library. He slammed his hands down on the keys in frustration, creating a final, jarring crash. The sound hung in the air, ugly and violent. For the first time ever, the clicking stopped. The sudden absence of that sound was louder than his crash. Leo froze, his back to her, his heart pounding. Finally, he thought, a bitter triumph in his chest. Asterisk finally, I made her react. I broke through. Asterisk he held his breath, waiting for her to speak. A word of shock or disapproval, or even concern. He heard the soft rustle of fabric. He pictured her putting her knitting gown on her lap. He waited. Seconds ticked by, measured by the old grandfather clock in the hall. Asterisk tick, tock, tick. Asterisk, then, the rustle came again. A gentle, familiar sound. The click-click resumed, steady as a heartbeat. That was it. That was all. She hadn't even cleared her throat. A wave of cold disappointment washed over Leo, cooling his anger into something sadder and heavier. He felt incredibly alone in the room. He had just thrown all his emotion, raw and loud, into the space between them, and it had hit that silent wall and dissolved into nothing. It was like shouting into a vast, soft canyon that gave back no echo. He closed the piano lid softly, the thud final and hollow. He didn't look at her as he walked out of the living room and up to his bedroom, where he could close a door and have a silence that felt like his own. From that day, something shifted in him. He didn't stop playing, he couldn't. The music had become too much a part of him. But he stopped playing for her. He stopped waiting for a reaction that was never going to come. He decided her silence was not deep listening, but simple absence. She was just an old woman passing time in a sunbeam while he made sounds nearby. his practice became more private, even though it happened in the same shared space. He retreated into the world of the music. When he played the beautiful, aching parts of Clair de Lune, he played for the lonely moon it described. When he practiced the powerful marshes, he played for the strength he wished he felt. The grandmother in the chair faded into the background of his awareness, becoming less of a person and more of a piece of the room's atmosphere, like the temperature or the quality of the light. He never noticed. In these new, inward-focused hours, the small details. He didn't see that on the days he played the sad, dreamy pieces. Her knitting would lie completely still in her lap for long periods, her hands resting motionless. He didn't catch the way her eyes, when he was lost in a particularly beautiful phrase, would close not in sleep, but as if to better see a memory. He never saw the single tear that once traced a slow path down her wrinkled cheek during a quiet minor key section. A tear she brushed away so quickly and discreetly, it might as well have never happened not to Leo. The wall was now complete and real. He was on one side, pouring his growing heart into the music. She was on the other, in a world of her own, separated by a barrier built not of stone or brick, but of years of experience, and of a silence he had completely misunderstood. He played on, the music getting better, richer, more full of feeling. And he did it believing, truly believing, that the person closest to him in the room wasn't hearing any of it at all. The rain had been falling for 2 days straight, a persistent gray drizzle that matched Leo's mood. He was 16 now, and the world felt full of puzzles he was supposed to already have the answers to. College brochures were piling up on the kitchen table, a silent, looming pressure. His friends seemed to have it all figured out, their paths straight and clear, while his own felt like a tangled ball of yarn dot. He was supposed to be studying for a history test, but the dates and treaties swam uselessly on the page. The quiet of the house felt heavy, broken only by the soft patter against the window and the low hum of the refrigerator. From downstairs, he could hear the faint, familiar sound of his grandmother moving around in her room. She'd been sorting things, he knew. His mother had mentioned something about clearing out an old closet. Grateful for any distraction, Leo pushed his textbook away. He wandered downstairs and stood in the doorway of her small, neat room. She was sitting on the edge of her bed, a small cardboard box beside her, filled with what looked like letters and photographs. A faint smell of cedar and old paper hung in the air. "Need any help?" he asked. Leaning against the door-frame dot, she looked up, her eyes a little cloudy, as if she'd been pulled back from a great distance. She smiled her small, gentle smile. "Maybe. There is a box high up in the closet." "For my weak bones?" Leo nodded and stepped into the room. It was always tidy, almost sparse. He opened the closet door. It was mostly empty, just a few winter coats and a couple of shoeboxes. On the top shelf, pushed all the way to the back, was a flat, rectangular box covered in a fine layer of dust. He had to stretch to reach it, his fingertips just grazing the edge before he could pull it down. It was lighter than he expected. The cardboard was soft at the corners. The color faded to a pale brown. He brought it over and placed it on the bed beside her. "This one?" he asked. She looked at the box as if she hadn't seen it in a lifetime. Her hand reached out, hovered over the lid for a moment, then withdrew. "Yes," she said softly. "You look. For me, the eyes are not so good with small things." Curious, Leo lifted the lid. Inside, there was no jumble of objects. It was orderly. A stack of envelopes, tied with a faded blue ribbon. A few small, hardcover books. And on top, a simple black folder. He picked up the folder first. He opened it. Inside, protected by a sheet of thin, crinkling tissue paper, was a photograph. It was black and white, the edges slightly deckle-edged. He drew it out carefully. The photograph showed a young woman. She was standing beside a grand piano in a room with high ceilings. She wore a dark, elegant dress that fell to her calves, her hair styled in soft waves away from her face. She wasn't looking at the camera, but rather had one hand resting lightly on the closed lid of the piano, her body turned slightly, her expression one of quiet, poised confidence. She was beautiful, but it was a beauty of composure and grace, not just of features. Leo stared. There was something in the shape of the eyes, the curve of the smile. "Is this—" he began, his voice barely a whisper. "A long time ago," his grandmother said from beside him, her own voice distant. He turned the photograph over. On the back, in elegant, looping handwriting in faded black ink, was a note. It was not in English. He could make out a date, 1952, and a place, Kyiv. But below that, written in a different, more careful hand, were a few words in English. Asterisk, my final recital. I played Chopin's Ballade No. 1. Asterisk, a cold, then hot, wave of understanding washed over him. It was her. It was his grandmother. At a piano? A grand piano in a recital hall. You played? He asked, though the answer was right there in his hands. The question felt stupid, huge. She nodded slowly, her eyes on the photograph in his hands, seeing a different scene. Yes, for many years. From when I was smaller than you. Leo's mind was racing, tumbling, rearranging everything. The silent hours in the armchair. The unreadable expression during his struggles with Beethoven and Debussy. The wall he thought was indifference. It wasn't a wall. It was an ocean. A vast, deep ocean of memory separating them. What happened? He asked, sitting down heavily on the bed beside the box. She was quiet for so long, he thought she might not answer. She picked up one of the small hard-cover books. It was a journal, the pages filled with dense, slanting script. She ran a finger over the cover. The war, she said finally, the word simple and heavy. Then the leaving. We could take only what we could carry. Not a piano. She gave a small, sad shrug that seemed to carry the weight of a lost world. The music, it stayed there. In that room. In the air. I left it. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and for the first time, Leo saw past the quiet old woman to the young girl in the photograph. He saw the loss, not as a historical fact, but as a personal, physical amputation. She hadn't just left a country. She had left a future, a version of herself, a language made of sound. Do you miss it? He asked, the question feeling painfully inadequate. A ghost of her old, poised smile touched her lips. The piano? Yes, every day. But the music? She tapped her temple, then her heart. That you do not lose. It sleeps. Leo looked back at the photograph, at the proud young woman beside her instrument. He thought of his own clumsy beginnings on the old upright, his frustration, his growing love for the pieces he played. He had been pouring his heart out for years, thinking he was speaking to a blank wall, when all along, he had been speaking to someone who understood the language fluently, someone for whom every note he played must have been a haunting echo of her own past. He felt a sudden, sharp shame for every bitter thought, every moment of childish frustration at her silence. Her silence wasn't empty. It was full. Too full, perhaps, for words. He carefully placed the photograph back in its folder, as if handling a holy relic. His eyes scanned the rest of the box's contents. There were a few loose sheets of handwritten music, the notes delicately penned. He didn't need to ask any more questions. The story was there, in the dust and the fading ink. He closed the box lid. The quiet in the room was different now. It wasn't her silence pressing on him. It was a shared, respectful quiet, thick with unspoken history, He helped her put the box on a lower shelf in her closet where she could reach it. He went back to his room, but he didn't open his history book. He sat on his bed, staring at the wall, hearing in his mind not the Czerny studies or the angry Beethoven, but the first simple halting scales he had ever played. He had been learning his ABCs in front of a novelist who had lost her pen dot. Everything had changed. The grandmother in the chair was gone. In her place was a woman he was only just beginning to meet, a musician, and he had, for all these years, been playing for her, without ever knowing who she really was. The thought was terrifying and humbling, and it filled him with a new, urgent purpose. He had to find a way to say something to her, not with words, but with the only language they now truly shared. The house felt different after that rainy afternoon. The air in the living room seemed to hold a new charge, a quiet significance that settled over everything like fine dust. The piano was no longer just Leo's instrument. It felt like a bridge suddenly visible, stretching across a chasm he hadn't even known was there. He couldn't just go back to practicing as usual. The scales and arpeggios felt trivial now, like whispering when you needed to speak from the heart. He had to say something, but words were impossible. What could he possibly say? Sorry, I didn't know you were a pianist. Sorry, I thought you were just an old lady napping. The conversation existed in a place beyond sentences. It had to be music, but not just any music. He couldn't play her Chopin's Ballade. That was hers, a ghost from her past he had no right to touch. Playing his current pieces, the Debussy and Beethoven, felt wrong too. They were his own emotional outlets, his teenage storms. This was different. This wasn't about expressing his feelings. It was about reaching out to hers. He went to his piano teacher the following week, the sheet music for a difficult Bach fugue in his bag. Before the lesson could start, he cleared his throat, his palms suddenly sweaty. I need to find a piece, he began, stumbling over the words. Something from, maybe Eastern Europe? Like a folk song, but for piano. Something beautiful, but sad. Not flashy. His teacher, a kind man with glasses perpetually sliding down his nose, looked at him with surprise. Leo had always been a diligent student, but he'd never requested music based on feeling before. It was usually about technique, or what was next in the syllabus. A folk song? The teacher mused, scratching his chin. There's a lot. Do you have a country in mind? Leo hesitated. He didn't want to say too much. Maybe. Something from that part of the world. Ukraine, or nearby. His teacher's eyes lit up with an idea. I might have just the thing. He rummaged through a crowded filing cabinet in the corner of his studio, muttering to himself. After a minute, he pulled out a few photocopied sheets, the edges curled. This is an arrangement of an old folk melody. It's called The Willow? It's simple at its core, but the arrangement is quite expressive. It's all about longing, a homesickness for a place you can't return to. Leo's heart clenched. It was perfect. He took the sheets as if they were made of glass. The first time he tried to play it at home, his fingers felt like thick, clumsy sticks. The melody was indeed simple, a mournful, winding tune that rose and fell like a sigh. But the harmony beneath it was complex, with strange, yearning chords that resolved in unexpected ways. It didn't sound like the music he was used to. It sounded ancient and full of stories. He practiced it in secret. He waited for times when his grandmother was in her room or the kitchen. He'd close the living room door, something he almost never did, and play the piece at a whisper, the soft pedal held down. His face close to the keys as he wrestled with the unfamiliar emotional landscape. Learning, it was an act of devotion. Every wrong note felt like a betrayal of the song's spirit. He wasn't just memorizing notes. He was trying to understand a feeling he had only glimpsed in a photograph and a few quiet sentences. He listened to recordings online, not of piano versions, but of old people singing it, their voices cracked and full of a pain that time had not softened. He wanted to capture that in the piano's voice. His regular practice suffered. His mother noticed. "Everything okay with the piano, honey? You seem distracted. Just working on something new," he'd mumble, not meeting her eye. He started rising early on weekends, before anyone else was awake. He would creep downstairs in the gray dawn light, the house silent and cool, and practice The Willow. In that stillness, the music felt alive. He began to feel the story in it, the gentle sway of the tree and the title, yes, but also the ache of distance, the memory of a riverbank, of a home left behind. He wasn't just playing notes. He was trying to paint her memory with sound. One afternoon, he was so absorbed he didn't hear her come in. He was in the middle of the piece, at a particularly hushed, trembling passage where the melody seemed to hang in the air, questioning. He finished the phrase and looked up, sensing a presence. She was standing in the doorway to the dining room, not in her usual chair. She held a teacup in both hands, steam curling gently in the sunlight. She wasn't looking at him. Her gaze was fixed on a point somewhere in the middle of the room, her expression unreadable. How long had she been there? He froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. This wasn't the plan. He wasn't ready. The piece was still rough in places, his interpretation still forming. This was supposed to be a finished offering, not a work in progress. She blinked slowly, as if waking from a dream, and her eyes met his. There was no smile this time, no nod, just a deep, profound looking. For a second, Leo saw not his grandmother, but the young woman from the photograph, hearing an echo from a life she thought was sealed away. Then, without a word, she turned and walked quietly back toward the kitchen. Leo let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. His hands were shaking. Had she recognized it? Had she hated it? Had it been a mistake? He couldn't tell. But her silence this time didn't feel like a wall. It felt like a held breath. Like she was waiting, too. That moment lit a fire under him. He practiced with a furious, focused energy. He polished the technical sections until they were smooth as river stones. He experimented with the tempo, slowing it down here, rushing a fraction there, trying to find the precise heartbeat of the song. He lived with the melody in his head, humming it while he did his homework, tapping its rhythm on his desk. The piece became an obsession. It was no longer just a song he was learning. It was a message he was crafting, word by careful word, in a language of feeling he was only just beginning to speak fluently. He was no longer the boy practicing scales for a silent judge. He was a young man preparing to speak, across time and loss, to the fellow musician who had been listening all along. He was going to play for her, not as his grandmother who sat in the chair, but as the girl who had once stood by the grand piano, full of hope and music, before the world changed. And this time, he would play it for her when he was ready, when it was perfect, when it could say everything his clumsy words never could. He would wait for the right moment, when the light in the living room was just so, and the house was quiet, and he would finally, truly play for her for the first time. The right moment didn't announce itself with a fanfare. It arrived quietly, on an ordinary Tuesday evening. Leo's parents had gone to a neighbor's house for a meeting. The house was steeped in a deep, comfortable silence, broken only by the soft ticking of the hall clock. The dishes were done. Homework was finished. There was no reason, and every reason. He found her in her usual chair, but she wasn't knitting. Her hands were folded in her lap, and she was just watching the last of the twilight bleed from the sky. The room was bathed in the soft, blue-gray light of early evening, before the lamps needed to be turned on. The piano was a dark silhouette against the window. His heart began a slow, heavy drumming in his chest. This was it. The piece was as ready as it would ever be. He had practiced it so many times he could feel its shape in his bones, the rise and fall of it like a second breathing. He walked to the piano, his footsteps sounding too loud in the quiet. He didn't say anything. He simply sat down on the familiar bench. The wood cooled through his pants. He opened the fallboard. He didn't take out the sheet music. He didn't need it. He placed his hands in his lap for a moment, taking a slow breath, trying to calm the nerves that buzzed in his fingertips. He wasn't thinking about technique now. He was thinking of the photograph, of the grand piano, of the word ballade, of a box of memories on a closet shelf. He was thinking of the word home as a place you can never go back to. He lifted his hands and began. The first notes of The Willow were barely a whisper, a tender, aching melody that emerged from the silence like a memory forming. His touch was feather-light, each note placed with a care that felt like reverence. He wasn't just playing a folk tune. He was trying to evoke the landscape it came from, the slow curve of a river, the whisper of leaves, a wide, empty sky dot. As the melody unfolded, he could feel the atmosphere in the room change. It wasn't something he saw. It was something he sensed, a shift in the very air behind him. The usual small sounds, the rustle of fabric, a sigh, the creak of the chair, were utterly absent. It was a listening so deep and complete, it had a physical weight. He moved into the second section. With a left hand introduced a gentle, rocking rhythm, like water against a bank. The right hand's melody grew more plaintive, a cry that was soft but unwavering. He let himself feel the homesickness in the chords, the strange, unresolved harmonies that yearned for a resolution they never quite reached. He thought of her leaving, of looking back one last time. He poured that feeling into the keys dot. He was so inside the music that he almost didn't hear it. A small, sharp intake of breath dot. It was so soft, but in the absolute stillness, it was as clear as a bell. It came from the chair by the window dot. Leo didn't stop. He didn't turn. His eyes stayed fixed on the black and white keys, now blurred by his own concentration. But every nerve in his body was focused on the space behind him. The piece built towards its gentle climax, a swelling of emotion that wasn't loud, but was overwhelmingly full. It was the sound of love for something lost, a love that persisted through the lost dot. As he played these bars, he heard another sound, a soft, wet sniffle. Then another. He kept playing, his own throat tightening. The music began its slow descent, the melody returning to its opening theme, but changed now, weary and wise, accepting. The final notes were a series of quiet, open chords that hung in the air, shimmering, before fading into silence. He let the last vibration die completely. The room was now quieter than it had ever been. The ticking of the clock seemed to have stopped. He could hear the ragged sound of his own breathing. Slowly, he lowered his hands from the keys, letting them rest in his lap. They were trembling. He turned. She was still in her chair, but she was not the same woman who had sat there for all those years. Her face, usually so placid, was transformed. Tears traced shining paths down the papery skin of her cheeks, catching the faint light from the window. They fell silently, steadily. Her knitting lay forgotten, a pool of yarn on the floor beside her. Her hands were no longer folded. One was pressed lightly over her mouth, as if holding in a century's worth of sound. Her eyes were not on him. They were wide, looking through him, through the wall, across oceans and decades. She was seeing that other room, that other piano, the ghost of her own hands on different keys. She was hearing every note he had ever played for her, the clumsy scales, the angry etudes, the dreamy Debussy, all filtered through this final, understanding melody. Leo didn't speak. He couldn't. There were no words in any language that fit this moment. He watched as a profound shudder went through her slight frame. Then, slowly, as if moving through deep water, she lowered the hand from her mouth. She looked at him then, truly looked at him, and he saw the young woman from the photograph, perfectly superimposed over her grandmother's face. In her wet eyes was pride and grief and a recognition so deep it felt like a collision of two worlds. She did something he would remember for the rest of his life. Very slowly, with a grace that spoke of a different time, she brought her hands together, not in a loud clap, but in a slow, deliberate, almost silent motion. Her palms touched once, twice, 3 times, making no sound louder than a falling leaf. It was an applause for the music, yes, but it was more than that. It was an acknowledgement of him, of his journey, of the message he had sent and she had finally fully received. It was a bridge, built note by note over years, finally crossed. A sob caught in Leo's chest, and he looked down at his own hands, the hands that had built that bridge. When he looked up again, she was wiping her cheeks with the backs of her hands, a small, wobbly smile now touching her lips. It was a real smile, one that reached her eyes, full of a sadness that was also a joy. "You found it," she said, her voice thick but clear. "The song under the songs." He nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. She nodded back, a world of understanding passing between them in that simple gesture. Then she leaned forward, picked up her knitting, and settled back into her chair. She looked out the window, where the first star had appeared in the deep blue sky. Her face was peaceful. Leo turned back to the piano. He didn't play The Willow again. He didn't play anything ambitious. He placed his fingers on the keys and began the most simple, basic C major scale. C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. Up and down. The foundation of everything. And as the simple, pure notes filled the quiet room, he knew she was hearing it not as a beginner's exercise, but for what it truly was, the first word of a conversation that had finally, after all these years, begun. He played on, and for the first time, the silence that wrapped around his music was not a wall, but a companionable, understanding quiet, full of everything that no longer needed to be said.